Welcome to Pantdora, my 1,000-gallon cloud rainforest vivarium, a personal biological project of mine where I've created an entire tropical ecosystem within glass. It's undoubtedly been the most mind-boggling experience, watching the vivarium and all its living creatures live out their lives as they would in the wild. And so far, despite the never-ending highs and lows, the rainforest ecosystem within has been surprisingly stable. That was until last week, with the sudden appearance of some unwelcome creatures. I spotted a swarm of ants on the forest floor. They looked like a new species of ant I hadn't seen yet in Pantdora. Or... wait a sec. No, they're not new. These were the Terra Raiders. But why did they look different and not as smooth? As I looked closer, that was when I realized what I was actually looking at. Oh no! Mites. And turns out, these mites weren't the only unwelcome guests appearing in the rainforest this week. I was in for the craziest surprise. Please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon. Welcome to the AC family. Enjoy. A super major came crawling along the forest floor, completely riddled from head to cloaca with mites. It looked so itchy and uncomfortable, and it pained me to watch as the super major crawled along, heading back home after a foraging expedition. Now you must be wondering where on earth these body mites came from. Well, I've had experience with ant mites in the past, and there are a couple of possibilities that could have occurred, and I think both will surprise you. But aside from these parasites, there were other unexpected and unwelcome guests that appeared in the rainforest this week that sent me screaming like I had seen a ghost. But before I get into all of that, there were other parasites appearing more and more in the rainforest that were equally as concerning. An acrobat ant came strolling along the surface of a syngonium leaf, gaster held high above its head in perma-threat pose. Like brandishing a formic acid gun, it wasn't afraid to fire at any moment. Now usually these ants are out to cause trouble, but today they had something else on their mind. It looked like it was invested in something on the surface of the leaves, as it licked its surface with delight and great interest. It was then that I noticed the fuzzy herd not too far away. Aha! Mbugs. The herd was producing the good stuff that our acrobat ants were relishing. I had a feeling this symbiotic partnership might happen at some point. So if you're new to mealybugs, these fuzzy plant insects are a type of plant parasite that sucks on the inner sap of plants. A gardener's nightmare, to be honest. But for ants, they are a dream to stumble upon because of this. They produce a sweet poop called honeydew, which is full of nutrients. Now we've already seen the acrobat ants tend to populations of scale insects, also plant parasites that produce honeydew, which they drank directly from the insects. But in this case, the mealybugs posed a bit of a challenge to the ants. They couldn't get near them because of the fuzz. Have a look at this mealybug colony, completely enveloped in the fuzz. That fuzz is a waxy type substance that is super sticky, like a spider web. And if you look closely, it looks like an ant already had the unfortunate event of getting stuck in the wax. Let's pretend to be an ant for a sec and try to touch some of the waxy fuzz. As you can see, it sticks directly onto the ends of my tweezers and overall is an effective deterrent to keep other animals away from them. Furthermore, the wax helps protect the babies, as seen as the tiniest yellow critters moving around in the waxy fuzz until they develop enough of the protective hairs to allow them to leave their main fuzzy wax home to start other colonies of mealybugs in other areas of the plant or their environment. Here in Pantdora, they just appeared one day, having been transported by way of some plants I had planted in the vivarium. And man, have these parasites just colonized the asparagus ferns, creating masses of mealybug waxy populations everywhere. I did try to release a ladybug into Pantdora, which feeds on plant insects like mealybugs, but it was nowhere to be seen now. It must have been eaten by something and died. But knowing they were producing ant food for the acrobat ants was promising, and cool to see this new symbiotic partnership between the mealybugs and the acrobat ants. The mealybugs were also helping to control the growth of all the plants, because sadly last week, the rainforest's principal herbivore, Stanley, our bush cricket, who had lived here since the beginning, had died. And in his absence, the plants of the rainforest had taken full advantage, especially up in the canopy. Our canopy at the top of our rainforest was now full of foliage, totally transforming the area. Our sleeping tree frogs were loving all this new leaf cover in their viney bedrooms. I then spotted our new praying mantis. Last week we also lost our primary praying mantis, the green reaper, who died after laying her ootheca, an egg sac, which I was watching like a hawk every day in hopes baby mantises would hatch from it. But this female mantis, who was happily feeding on a cricket, was the Green Reaper's heiress to the throne. And she also loved being up in the canopy, where she snatched passing insects along the vines. Speaking of egg sacs, there was another mother caring for her egg sac that I was also keeping an eye on. Lady Deathstrike, our resident giant huntsman spider, stood unwaveringly by the rock waterfall, clutching her round dome-shaped egg sac against her body, protecting it with her life. It had been 2 weeks now that she had laid this egg sac, and I was interested to see if babies would hatch from it, because as some of you may recall, Lady Deathstrike had already laid an egg sac from a single mating a few months back, and those babies were already released into Pantdora. If babies emerge from this egg sac, it means this species is capable of saving sperm from a single mating to produce multiple egg sacs. Only time would tell if more Huntsman babies were on the way. And my intuition was that they were, seeing as Lady Deathstrike was still mothering her egg sac after 2 whole weeks. As for her first set of babies, they were all enjoying Pantdora, growing up in their tropical paradise. It was hard to judge how many of the hundreds of Huntsman youngins had survived, as they each had found their comfortable spot to hang and catch food. Plus, their cannibalist instincts had begun to set in. It looked like this Huntsman baby was feeding on a smaller Huntsman baby. The Huntsman rule of the rainforest was the more you eat, the bigger you get, and the less likely you will be eaten, even by your own siblings. A lot of you were worried that 400 or so Huntsman babies might cause the total collapse of the ecosystem, but I knew that nature produces hundreds of spiderlings for a reason. The great majority don't make it to adulthood, and many fall victim to predators. Check out this spider that lost its legs, probably due to a predator trying to eat it. Better to lose a few legs that can grow back after a few sheds than your life, right? I could see evidence of the spiders growing through leftover shed skin left all around. In a nearby fern, I spotted another piece of shed skin. This might look like a dead roach, but nope, because if you look up there in the driftwood, you'll see who it belongs to. It's a dubia roach, still light-colored as it hardened in its new skin. I always found this shedding process, known scientifically as ecdysis, amazing. Consider us humans for a moment. We humans don't need to shed like arthropods do because our skin cells are constantly renewing, then shedding and flaking off as we scratch, sweat, or go about our own business in life. But all arthropods, from insects to arachnids, have a hardened shell as skin, which is awesome for protection. But the drawback is it's not so stretchable and self-renewing like our skin. so all arthropods need to constantly shed as they grow. A new layer of exoskeleton develops underneath the exoskeleton, and they shed, exposing their new exoskeleton, which at first is soft and white. During this period that the insect is hardening, the new skin expands to the new size, larger than their old exoskeleton, and it develops melanin to darken in color. The development of melanin after each molt is actually why there are no albino insects, crustaceans, or arachnids. But this hardening period, known scientifically as tanning, is a dangerous time for the insects, as they can't really fend for themselves during this period and can easily fall victim to predators. So this roach is smart to crawl into this wooden crack like this. But now on the topic of arthropods transiting into new life stages as they grow, this brings me now to addressing the mites on our ants. Here's where things get interesting, guys. So in my experience with keeping ants, there are two kinds of ant body mites. Well, actually three, but for our purposes, these mites on the marauders are one of two of the following types. One, vampiric blood-sucking mites that eventually kill the ants, which I hope these mites aren't, because if they are, these ants will all be wiped out pretty quickly, maybe in a week. But these mites could also just be passengers. Yup, passengers, called phoretic mites, which are actually normal ground mites that feed on decaying material that have transformed into a sort of dormant life stage of mite that stick onto the bodies of insects when environmental conditions become unfavorable for the mites. Phoretic mites don't actually harm the host insects, they only hitch a ride. Good thing is, phoretic mites do transform back into ordinary mites once environmental conditions return to normal, thereby detaching from the host insects. The aim of these kinds of mites is that the host insects transport them to new favorable areas where they can fall off and live. If these were phoretic mites, I suspect that the sudden warmer temperatures, due to the approach of the new warmer season where I live, caused the mites to become phoretic body mites, and we're just waiting for the weather to cool down again. It's a cool adaptation if you ask me. So the big question was, were these the bad blood-sucking mites, or were they simply phoretic mites? Well, AC family, I had a plan to find out, and I'll show you how. Get out of here, you! This is my stage! I'm sorry, my lady. Where were we again? I'm not interested. Your black exoskeleton mirrors my heart's void. Without you, girl. That doesn't even rhyme. What? I said get out of here! Go! Okay. Your fat legs make me want to I actually liked him. Spot. Where'd he go? Yoo-hoo! The female had had enough and just wanted to relax, despite the male singing his not-so-flattering song to her. The male crickets have been non-stop wanting to breed, especially with the oncoming warmer temperatures. As a result, there were so many baby crickets wandering the lands now. But watch this baby cricket. It approached a clump of mealybugs, attracted to the smell of honeydew, and began to lick. Tasty. Now, do you see that light flickering in the back? That is the result of wind moving the blinds of my ant room. It started to grow windy in my area, and so I've begun to increase the frequency of the periodic winds that blow through Pantdora to mirror that detail in weather. The wind in Pantdora is produced by an electric fan set on a timer that blows fresh air into the vivarium from the outside, creating the most refreshing breeze flowing through the forest. It was actually quite therapeutic to watch. Even in the thickest of forests, there is movement of air, and many terrarium builders and keepers of animals forget to incorporate air movement and wind into their setups, which is important at moving oxygen around for the animals, carbon dioxide for the plants, keeping mold at bay, and relevant to our ant mite problem, lowering temperatures. You see, I suspect that the sudden heat wave that happened last week caused the ground mites to become phoretic. All I needed to do was simply cool temperatures down a bit, a couple of degrees, and the mites would simply proceed to their next life stage and become regular mites again. So instead of the 4 times a day that the fan used to turn on, I increased the frequency of the wind to occur every other hour. Only time would tell if this would help relieve the ants of their mite problem. But another adjustment I made to the climate to help lower the temperatures was this. Rain. I loved watching it rain in Pantdora. There was just something so calming about watching storms roll through the rainforest. The waters were life-giving and cleansing, and it seemed almost spiritual every time Pandoran rains blew through. So to help further cool down the rainforest, I increased the length of time that it rained, as well as the frequency, just for this week, to see if it would help the mite problem. The rains ended, and as much as I enjoyed watching the rainforest during the storms, I also enjoyed watching life in the rainforest post-rains. A nomad took advantage of the loose soils and began nest construction, moving large pieces of dirt from below ground. I still don't know the exact species of these ants. Anyone care to take a stab? Millipedes, now the most abundant detritivore on the forest floor, emerged in droves due to the moisture. Have a look. These lighter-colored millipedes had just molted and were in the process of tanning, but knew the moisture would be excellent at softening their favorite food types along the forest floor. The rains had made these decaying vines soft and more chewable, as well as this piece of sunskink poop, which another millipede was going to town on. Yum. But as cute as the millipedes were, these creatures that gave me the shivers were also emerging in abundance after the rains. Land planaria, carnivorous flatworms, slithered through the moss in search of prey. These things gave me the heebie-jeebies, even more so than the normal earthworms, which also slinky around above ground every time it rained. Notice the difference in movement, though, between the earthworm and the land planaria. One stretches then contracts as it moves, and the other just kinda slides along like a slug. That's how I can tell the two apart. But to my surprise, the rains had caused a brand new creature I never imagined would be living in Pantdora to reveal itself for the very first time. It was crawling on the forest floor. Look! A centipede crawled around inspecting the darkened spaces of the leaf litter for prey. I couldn't believe we had a centipede in the rainforest. It must have been one of the many creatures introduced into the forest without me knowing, through the plants. And look, as it crawled under this leaf, it looked like it ran into another centipede. See the legs? Centipedes are significant predators in ecosystems, and I was so happy to see them in Pantdora. My question though was this a hatchling of a giant species of centipede? Or was it full grown? My guess was the former, seeing as they suddenly only appeared now, as if a bunch of them just hatched from eggs in soil. Anyways, I couldn't wait to tell. And if it was one of those giant centipedes, you better believe I would not be setting my foot into the vivarium forever, as they are highly venomous as adults. I hoped it would eat the planaria. The rains also brought joy and new life to the plants, especially the mosses. Have a look at how beautiful this species of moss is, as it captured beads of water that look like perfect giant glass balls. The rains caused our mossy hill to also flourish and bloom. Now, speaking of this mossy hill, this is the territory of our resident sunskink Smog. But I had grown worried over the past few days. I'm sad to share that Smog had strangely gone missing. It was now the 4th day that Smog has been nowhere in sight. I would usually see him basking during the day at all his favorite spots, but not these past 4 days. This began to worry me greatly, and obviously the idea that he had died haunted me, especially because I had traumatically lost 2 of my favorite animals over the past week. But I suspected that Smog was perhaps laying dormant due to the heat, hiding out deep inside his mossy hill. I made sure to always smell the vivarium for the stench of a rotting carcass. But so far, all I could smell was the usual refreshing zing of tropical plants and moss. I resolved to look inside the hill with my endoscopic camera if he continued to go missing the next day. The nightly mists blew through Pantdora, hydrating the lands. A gecko had emerged to begin its nightly hunt. They were shy and elusive creatures. Our Mantis was asleep up high in the canopy. Isopods had emerged to feed on decaying material all over the rainforest. The mite-infested supermajor was still wandering the forest floor. Up high in the canopy were the tree frogs, emerging to feed on insects. Here was Kermit, and up there was Miss Piggy. I loved seeing the frogs in their new lush canopy. By the way, it was World Frog Day a few days ago. So to all of you frog fans, happy World Frog Day. Frogs are some of the world's most underrated animals, in my opinion. I mean, consider the fact that they have such cool skin. It looks like Kermit here is shedding his skin tonight. See him vibrating and opening his mouth? Frogs shed their upper layers of skin by moving their bodies, then eating the skin afterwards for nourishment. Another cool thing about frog skin is it's super permeable. In fact, frogs don't need to drink water through their mouths. It's just absorbed through their skin, as well as nutrients and even oxygen molecules. In fact, because frogs have such permeable skin, they are good bioindicators of whether an environment is good or bad. If an area is populated with lots of frogs, it indicates a good and safe environment. And Pantdora had 4 very healthy and happy froggies. By morning, our sunskink Smog was still nowhere to be seen, and so it was time to go in to the mossy hill with my endoscopic camera. It was time to find out if our golden dragon of a skink had died or was asleep in his darkened cave. I went in with the camera probe. All right, where are you, my dragon? All I could see was soil and darkness. And the frame of the inside of the mossy hill. I continued to inspect all areas of the darkness I could access. To my disappointment, Smog was nowhere to be seen. Had he buried himself into the soils? I began to grow extremely worried. Could he be behind the moss wall on the other end of the vivarium, where I spotted Rocksteady climbing? But just as I was about to look, I noticed a tiny head peeping out at me. "What are you doing?" Smog inquired from high up at the rock wall. "Smog! There you are! I was looking everywhere for you." I guess the bright light of the camera probing his lair spooked him out and caused him to flee through a back door. Oops, My bad, Smog. Didn't mean to scare you. I suspected that I was correct. The heat had caused him to remain a bit dormant below ground until things got cooler. But temperatures were now slightly cooler than it was this past week, and Smog was just waking up to go back to his regular routine of sunbathing and hunting. But a scene on the forest floor caught my eye. A dying cricket was being attacked by the supermajor we had been tracking all this time. But the sight broke my heart as I watched the ant clearly encumbered by the mites. These mites truly looked uncomfortable to deal with. I suspect that both phoretic mites and parasitic mites really prefer to attach onto ants because once ants are adults, emerging from their pupal stage, they no longer shed their exoskeletons for the rest of their life as they remain the same size until their death, which was good news for the mites. Normally, this ant would be on its way back to the nest after finding this dying cricket to inform the colony of its new find. But instead, I was so saddened to watch the ant simply lay there, motionless, on the forest floor. Poor ant. But as it stood still, I noticed something. Do you guys see it too? Is it just me, or are there less mites than yesterday? Have a look at the supermajor yesterday. And have a look at it now. Yes, this could be a different supermajor, but regardless, based on past experience with phoretic mites, all ants of a single colony have generally the same degree of infestation, seeing as they all live in the same place underground, where the mites attach to them when they become phoretic. But do you guys notice that there are now less mites? If this was the case, then perhaps the mites were phoretic and were gradually proceeding to their next life stage to fall off the bodies of our Terra Raiders. I would be able to know for sure within a week's time. If the Terra Raiders eventually disappear from the rainforest, I'll know that these mites are indeed blood-sucking ant mites. If the mites disappear from the ants' bodies, I'll know they were harmless phoretic mites. I'll be sure to keep my eye on the ants and let you all know. As concerning as all of this was, I knew inside, parasites had an important role in the ecosystem. I mean, they had to, right? I couldn't think of one off the top of my head. So I did some research. The formal definition of a parasite is an organism that lives in or on an organism of another species, its host, and benefits by deriving nutrients at the other's expense. And then, upon further thought, I realized that parasitism is an important process in the evolution of life over a very long time. And here's why. Consider yourself. We humans are the result of a number of parasites going back to when we were just unicellular life living in the ocean. It is believed that mitochondria, remember the powerhouse of the cell, actually began as a totally separate organism billions of years ago that were engulfed, i.e. eaten or taken in by larger cells. The ancient form of mitochondria then became a sort of parasite that benefited from the larger cell that it lived in, until one day they became one, and the larger cell began to benefit from the mitochondria's presence. Every cell in your body today, and that of all living animals, is the result of a parasitism that actually worked out billions of years ago. Plus, you and I and all animals continue to harbor parasites, and sometimes those parasites end up doing good for you. The microbes living in your gut, helping you digest food, the various species of mites that live on your skin, eating dead skin cells, or in the follicles of your eyelashes, eating up sebum oils. Parasitism happens in all life forms, and at times, the union of parasite and host actually benefits both parties. In the case of the mealybugs in Pantdora, consider that, yes, the mealybugs are parasites to the plants, and one might feel they don't particularly benefit the host plant, right? But as I watched the acrobat ants frequenting the leaves, I began to realize that perhaps having all these acrobat ants around might in the long run actually deter plant pests like caterpillars. In this case, having the mealybugs around, taking some of their life juices, is a worthy cost in exchange for safety from herbivores. What if the protective mealybug hairs also help ward off caterpillars and dangerous herbivores too? Understanding this partnership helped me realize the brilliance of Mother Nature and hence reconcile the existence of parasites in the natural world and in our rainforest of Pantdora. I just prayed our terror raiders would be okay. Despite the presence of parasites in the rainforest, one thing I was grateful for was the absence of invasives. I spotted a group of acrobat ants around a hole in the stump. It looks like the acrobat ants have set up a nest inside the hole. I was afraid the stump was being occupied by the invasive black crazy ants, named the Dark Horde, that were once a huge problem in the rainforest. Before we were able to cull their numbers down, I now only saw a few black crazy ant workers here and there. I knew the Dark Horde was nesting somewhere, working on bringing their numbers back up. Or maybe they were dying out now, being outcompeted by the acrobat ants. But for now, I was so relieved to see a Pantdora devoid of invasives. Finally, no black crazy ants, no fire ant. Wait, what is that? A ghost ant! How did a ghost ant get in here? Oh no! I'm afraid a new ant war has come. Vote in my community tab to affect this story.